The fluorescent lights in the evidence room hummed with the kind of persistent buzz that gets under your skin after 8 hours. Detective Sarah Chen had been listening to that sound for 6 months now, cataloging seized weapons and tagging drug evidence while the rest of the Metro Police Department moved on without her. The air was thick with the smell of old cardboard, dust, and the faint chemical tang of processed narcotics that never quite left the ventilation system. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She moved through the narrow aisles between metal shelving units with practiced efficiency, her scanner beeping softly as she logged each item into the digital database. Box after box of confiscated firearms, their serial numbers carefully recorded, their stories untold. Her movements were precise, economical, the kind of muscle memory that comes from years of handling weapons under pressure. But here, in the basement of the precinct, precision didn't matter to anyone except the quarterly audit team. The evidence room was where careers went to die quietly, where officers who'd made the wrong enemies or crossed the wrong lines found themselves counting down to retirement. Sarah wasn't anywhere near retirement age, but at 32, she felt every day of the 18 months since her dismissal from the Special Weapons and Tactics Unit. SWAT had been her world, her identity, the place where her particular combination of analytical thinking and split-second decision-making had meant something. Now she sorted evidence and filled out forms in triplicate, while her former teammates responded to high-risk warrants and hostage situations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was logging the weapons other officers had taken off the streets, weapons she would have been the one to neutralize if things had gone differently. A group of patrol officers walked past the evidence room door, their conversation carrying clearly in the quiet hallway. Their voices had that particular tone of cops sharing gossip, the kind that spreads through a department like wildfire. Sarah didn't look up from her work, but her ears caught the familiar rhythm of speculation and judgment. "Still can't believe Chen's down there playing inventory clerk," one of them said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure she could hear. "What a waste. She used to be something, you know." Another voice joined in, younger and more careless. "My training officer told me she was the best marksman SWAT ever had, could put a round through a quarter at 100 yards. Now look at her." "Yeah, well, being a good shot doesn't matter if you can't follow orders," a third voice added with the certainty of someone who thought he knew the whole story. Chief Morrison made the right call. SWAT's no place for loose cannons. Sarah's hands never paused in their work, but something tightened in her jaw. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the past 6 months. The official story was that she'd been insubordinate during a critical operation, that she'd questioned direct orders and compromised team safety. The truth was more complicated, but the truth rarely survived contact with department politics. The patrol officers moved on, their voices fading down the corridor toward the locker rooms. Sarah continued scanning evidence, each beep of the scanner marking another small piece of someone else's case, someone else's victory against the chaos that seeped through the city's streets every night. Her radio crackled softly from its position on the evidence room desk. Dispatch coordinating patrol units. Detectives requesting backup. The constant flow of communication that kept the department functioning. Sarah had turned the volume down until it was barely audible. Background noise that reminded her she was still part of the machine, even if she was relegated to its forgotten corners. A stack of case files sat on the corner of her desk, each one representing hours of investigation by detectives who trusted her to properly catalog and preserve their evidence. It was important work, necessary work, but it wasn't the work she'd trained for. It wasn't the work that had made her feel like she was making a difference in a world that seemed to produce new threats faster than law enforcement could respond to them. She picked up another evidence bag, this one containing a modified semi-automatic pistol that had been used in an armed robbery. The modifications were professional, precise, the kind of work that spoke of serious criminal intent. Sarah noted the alterations in her report, documenting the illegal modifications that would help prosecutors make their case. In another life, she might have been the one to take this weapon away from its owner, to end a standoff before anyone got hurt. The evidence room door opened with a soft click, and Detective Mike Rodriguez stepped inside, carrying a box of items from a domestic violence case. He nodded to Sarah with the kind of professional courtesy that had replaced the easy camaraderie they'd once shared. Rodriguez had been one of the few officers who'd publicly supported her during the aftermath of the incident that ended her SWAT career, and the department had made sure he understood the cost of that loyalty. "Morning, Chen," he said, setting the box on the intake counter. "Got some items from the Hartwell case." Victim finally decided to press charges. Sarah looked up from her scanner, noting the careful distance Rodriguez maintained. He was being watched, just like she was, and any appearance of continued friendship could hurt his chances for advancement. She understood the politics, even if she didn't like them. "I'll get them logged in," she said, reaching for the intake forms. "Any special handling requirements?" Rodriguez shook his head, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. In that brief look, Sarah saw something that might have been regret or sympathy, or just the acknowledgement of how quickly things could change in their line of work. Then he turned and left, closing the door behind him with the same soft click. The morning stretched on with its familiar rhythm of scanning, logging, and filing. Sarah's mind wandered while her hands worked, thinking about the trajectory that had brought her to this place. She'd graduated from the police academy at the top of her class, earned her detective shield in record time, and been selected for SWAT after demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking and marksmanship that the unit desperately needed. For 3 years, she'd been part of something that mattered. High-risk warrants, hostage rescues, counter-terrorism operations that never made the news but kept the city safe. She'd been good at it, better than good. Her teammates had trusted her judgment, relied on her accuracy, counted on her to make the shots that ended threats without creating new ones. Then came the operation that changed everything. A hostage situation in a downtown office building. A gunman with military training and nothing to lose. The official after-action report painted a picture of an officer who'd refused direct orders, who'd taken unauthorized action that put civilian lives at risk. The truth was that Sarah had seen something the incident commander had missed, had recognized a tactical situation that required immediate action rather than prolonged negotiation. Her single shot had ended the crisis and saved lives, but it had also ended her career with SWAT. Because she'd taken the shot without explicit authorization, because she'd made a command decision that wasn't hers to make, the department had found her guilty of insubordination and tactical misconduct. The hostages went home to their families, the gunman was neutralized without additional casualties, and Sarah Chen was reassigned to evidence management. Chief Morrison had made the decision personally, his face granite hard during the disciplinary hearing. Sarah had respected Morrison once, had seen him as a leader who understood the complexities of police work in a modern city. But that respect had died during the hearing, when Morrison had made it clear that following the chain of command mattered more than results, that the appearance of discipline was more important than the reality of saving lives. Now she sorted through the detritus of other people's cases, wondering if she'd made the right choice. She could have taken the shot differently, could have waited for authorization that might never have come. She could have let the situation play out according to protocol while innocent people died. But that wasn't who she was, and it wasn't the kind of officer she'd trained to become. The radio crackled again, louder this time, and Sarah caught fragments of a developing situation. Multiple units responding to a disturbance at City Hall, reports of shots fired, possible active shooter scenario. Her hand moved toward the radio volume control before she stopped herself. It wasn't her call anymore. Other officers would handle it. Other SWAT members would respond if the situation escalated. She went back to her evidence logging, trying to ignore the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with hearing about tactical situations. The scanner beeped steadily as she worked through another box of seized firearms, each one representing a threat removed from the streets, a potential tragedy prevented. It was meaningful work, she reminded herself, just not the work she'd been born to do. The morning shift change brought a parade of officers past the evidence room door, their conversations a mixture of case updates, shift gossip, and the eternal complaints about department politics. Sarah listened with half an ear while maintaining her focus on the endless stream of evidence that flowed through the room. Drugs, weapons, stolen property, the physical manifestations of human desperation and criminal intent. Detective Lisa Park stopped by with evidence from a gang shooting, her demeanor professional but distant. Park had been friendly before Sarah's fall from grace, but departmental politics had a way of clarifying where loyalties lay. She handed over the evidence bags without making eye contact, filled out the required paperwork, and left without the small talk that had once characterized their interactions. Sarah understood. In a department where careers could be derailed by association with the wrong people, self-preservation took precedence over friendship. She'd made her choices and accepted the consequences, but that didn't make the isolation any easier to bear. The evidence room had become her world, 4 walls lined with metal shelving and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. She'd memorized every crack in the concrete floor, every scuff mark on the walls, every sound that echoed through the building above her. The footsteps of officers heading to roll call, the distant ring of phones in the detective bureau, the mechanical sounds of a police department that never slept. Occasionally, former SWAT teammates would pass by the evidence room door, usually without stopping. They carried themselves differently than regular patrol officers, with the particular confidence that came from elite training and high-stakes operations. Sarah recognized the walk, the awareness, the way they automatically scanned their environment for threats and opportunities. She'd walked that way once, before the department had decided that following orders was more important than saving lives. Sergeant Tom Walsh appeared in the doorway just before lunch, his SWAT gear marking him as someone responding to or returning from a tactical call. He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the evidence room, closing the door behind him. Walsh had been Sarah's team leader, the one who'd tried to defend her actions during the disciplinary process. "Chen," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of shared history and current limitations. "How are you holding up?" Sarah looked up from her work, noting the careful way Walsh positioned himself near the door, ready to leave quickly if someone important walked by. Even this brief conversation could be seen as inappropriate, a violation of the unofficial ban on treating her like a fellow officer rather than a cautionary tale. "I'm fine," she said, which was true in the most basic sense. She was functioning, completing her assigned tasks, adapting to her new circumstances with the same discipline she'd brought to SWAT operations. "How's the team?" Walsh's expression tightened slightly. "Different. We've got new protocols, new command structure. Everything's more—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Rigid. Less room for individual judgment calls." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying directly. Her actions had prompted a departmental review that had resulted in stricter oversight of SWAT operations, more layers of authorization required for tactical decisions. The unit was still functional, but the flexibility that had made them effective in fluid situations had been sacrificed for the appearance of better control. "Morrison's bringing in new people," Walsh continued, glancing toward the door. "Fresh academy graduates, officers from other departments. People who don't know how things used to work." The implication was clear. Chief Morrison was systematically replacing the institutional memory that might have supported Sarah's version of events, filling SWAT with officers who would accept the new protocols without question. It was smart politics, eliminating the possibility of future challenges to his authority. Walsh moved toward the door, their conversation reaching its natural conclusion. "Take care of yourself, Chen. This won't last forever." But Sarah wasn't sure she believed that anymore. The department had invested too much in the narrative of her misconduct to easily reverse course. Admitting that she'd been right about the tactical situation would mean admitting that Chief Morrison had been wrong, and institutional pride rarely allowed for that kind of acknowledgement. After Walsh left, Sarah returned to her evidence processing with renewed focus. The work was methodical, requiring attention to detail but little creative thinking. Each item had to be properly cataloged, photographed if necessary, and stored according to strict chain-of-custody protocols. It was the kind of work that could be done competently by almost anyone, which was probably the point. The afternoon brought a steady stream of evidence from various cases, each delivery a reminder of the ongoing work of law enforcement happening above her head. Sarah processed drug seizures from narcotics raids, weapons from domestic violence cases, financial records from white-collar investigations. The diversity of criminal activity was almost impressive in its scope and creativity. She was logging a computer hard drive from a cybercrime case when the building's emergency alarm system activated. The sharp, insistent tone cut through the usual background noise of the precinct, followed immediately by announcements over the PA system. Code Silver. All available personnel to respond. Shots fired at City Hall. Sarah's hands stilled on the keyboard as the familiar surge of tactical awareness flooded through her. Code Silver meant an active shooter situation, the kind of call that brought every available officer running. She could hear feet pounding in the hallways above, voices calling out instructions, the controlled chaos of a police department mobilizing for a major incident. Her radio, still turned down low, crackled with urgent communications. Units requesting backup, tactical teams being deployed, command staff coordinating the response. Sarah reached for the volume control before catching herself. She wasn't part of the response anymore. Her job was to stay in the evidence room and continue processing paperwork while other officers dealt with the crisis. But old habits die hard, and Sarah found herself analyzing the radio traffic with professional interest. The situation was complex, with multiple shooters and civilian hostages. The kind of scenario that required careful coordination and precise tactical thinking. The kind of scenario where her particular skills might have made a difference. She forced herself to return to the computer hard drive, entering the serial number and case information with mechanical precision. Above her, the building continued to empty as officers deployed to the scene. The evidence room felt more isolated than usual, cut off from the urgent purpose that was driving the rest of the department. Minutes passed, then an hour. The radio traffic indicated a fluid situation with multiple complications. Hostages were involved, making aggressive tactics risky. The shooters were well armed and apparently prepared for extended resistance. It was exactly the kind of situation that Sarah had trained for, the kind of challenge that had made SWAT work meaningful. She completed the computer hard drive entry and moved on to the next item, a collection of financial documents from a fraud investigation. The numbers and account information blurred together as her mind remained focused on the radio communications coming from City Hall. Professional habit made her track the tactical situation, analyzing the information flow and trying to build a mental picture of what the responding officers were facing. The evidence room door opened again, and Detective Rodriguez appeared with a concerned expression. "Chen, you hear about City Hall?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The isolation of the evidence room had never felt more pronounced than it did now, when her training and experience were desperately needed, but officially irrelevant. "It's bad," Rodriguez continued, stepping fully into the room and closing the door. "Multiple shooters. They're well organized. Someone's been planning this for months." Sarah's tactical mind automatically began processing the implications. Organized shooters with advanced planning suggested military or law enforcement training, possibly with inside knowledge of police response protocols, the kind of threat that required unconventional thinking and rapid adaptation. "SWAT's been deployed?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the radio traffic. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Full tactical response. But these guys are different, Chen. They're not just criminals with guns. They know what they're doing." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent transmission over Sarah's radio. "Officer down." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Request immediate medical assistance." The voice was strained, professional calm, barely containing underlying panic. Sarah recognized the call sign. It was one of the SWAT officers, someone she'd worked with during her time with the unit. Rodriguez was listening to his own radio, his expression growing more concerned. "They need everyone they can get. Command is pulling officers from all over the city." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying directly. In a situation this serious, departmental politics became secondary to operational necessity. Officers who might normally be excluded from tactical operations could find themselves pressed into service. But her reassignment to evidence management wasn't just political. It was official discipline that couldn't be ignored, even in an emergency. "I should get back," Rodriguez said, moving toward the door. "Captain wants all detectives ready for deployment if this spreads." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the evidence room, listening to the radio traffic and feeling the weight of enforced irrelevance. She'd spent years training for exactly this kind of situation, developing the skills and judgment that could save lives when everything went wrong. Now she was relegated to paperwork, while other officers faced threats they might not be prepared for. The afternoon stretched on with updates from City Hall, painting an increasingly complex picture. The shooters had taken multiple hostages and barricaded themselves in the building's upper floors. They were communicating with negotiators but making demands that suggested this was more than a simple criminal enterprise. Political motivations were becoming apparent. along with a level of tactical sophistication that was challenging the standard police response. Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on evidence processing, her mind constantly drawn to the radio communications and the tactical situation developing across the city. She'd been in similar situations before, had been part of the teams that resolved hostage crises and neutralized armed threats. The knowledge that her experience could be valuable, combined with the reality that it was officially unwanted, created a tension that was almost physical in its intensity. The call came at 4:17 p.m., crackling through the radio with the kind of urgency that cuts through all other noise. Sarah was processing evidence from a robbery case when the transmission made her freeze in place. Chief Morrison's voice, tight with controlled stress, cutting through the routine radio chatter. All units, be advised. Suspect vehicle fleeing City Hall incident. Black SUV, license plate David Tom 7492, multiple armed occupants. Vehicle last seen northbound on 5th Street, heading toward the residential district. Sarah's tactical mind immediately began calculating routes and response options. The residential district meant civilian exposure, potential for additional hostages, complicated pursuit scenarios. She reached for her radio volume, turning it up to catch every detail of the developing situation. Units 7 and 12 in pursuit, came the response. Suspects are heavily armed, returning fire. Requesting tactical backup. The evidence room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as Sarah listened to her former colleagues coordinating a high-risk pursuit through city streets. She knew those voices, had worked with those officers, understood their capabilities and limitations. The familiar urge to respond, to be part of the solution, rather than a passive observer, was almost overwhelming. Suspect vehicle has crashed at the intersection of 5th and Maple, the radio crackled. Multiple suspects on foot, fleeing into the residential area. Shots fired. Civilians in the area. Sarah's hands stilled on the evidence bag she'd been processing. 5th and Maple was 6 blocks from the precinct, in a neighborhood of small houses and apartment buildings. Families would be coming home from work, children playing in yards. Ordinary people suddenly thrust into an extraordinary dangerous situation. Establishing perimeter, came another voice, requesting K-9 units and additional patrol for area containment. But Sarah knew the math. Every available officer was either at City Hall dealing with the main incident or spread thin across the city, covering normal patrol duties. The resources needed for a proper containment operation simply weren't available, not with the department's primary tactical assets committed to the hostage situation downtown. She stood up from her desk, pacing the small confines of the evidence room as the radio continued to provide updates. 3 suspects confirmed on foot, armed with military-style weapons. Civilian evacuations in progress. Schools in the area placed on lockdown. The systematic approach of a well-coordinated law enforcement response. But Sarah could hear the strain in the voices, the reality that they were stretching available resources beyond optimal limits. Suspects spotted entering the residential complex at 412 Maple Street, the radio reported. Multiple apartment buildings, unknown number of civilians inside. Sarah knew that complex. Low-income housing with families. Elderly residents, people who might not respond quickly to evacuation orders, or who might not have anywhere else to go. The kind of environment where armed suspects could either find easy hostages or create a prolonged standoff that would tie up even more resources. She moved to the evidence room's small window, which offered a limited view of the street outside the precinct. Police vehicles were racing past with lights and sirens, every available unit being committed to either the main incident or the expanding pursuit situation. The normal buffer of patrol units that would typically handle routine calls was gone, leaving the city temporarily vulnerable. Command to all units. Chief Morrison's voice returned to the radio. We have reports of a 4th suspect who may have separated from the group. Unknown location. Assume armed and extremely dangerous. A 4th suspect. Sarah's mind immediately began calculating the tactical implications. If one of the shooters had broken away from the group during the initial escape, he could be anywhere in the city. No longer contained to the residential district, no longer predictable in his movements. A mobile threat with unknown intentions, and the demonstrated willingness to engage law enforcement. The radio traffic intensified as units struggled to coordinate containment with limited personnel. Sarah recognized the voices of patrol officers being asked to perform tactical operations they weren't fully trained for. detectives being pulled from their normal duties to assist with perimeter control. Everyone doing their best with insufficient resources and incomplete information. Officer requesting backup at 418 Maple, came an urgent transmission. Possible suspect location, need tactical support. The pause that followed was telling. In normal circumstances, SWAT would respond immediately to provide the tactical expertise needed for a building search involving armed suspects. But SWAT was committed to City Hall, and patrol officers were being asked to handle situations that exceeded their training and equipment capabilities. Backup is en route, dispatch finally responded, but Sarah could hear the hesitation. Backup was coming, but it would be patrol officers with standard equipment facing suspects with military-grade weapons and tactical training. Sarah found herself studying the duty roster posted on the evidence room wall, mentally cataloging which officers were available and what their capabilities were. Detective Martinez was solid, but had limited tactical experience. Officer Thompson was brave, but inexperienced with high-risk operations. Sergeant Williams had tactical training but was nearing retirement and hadn't been on an active operation in years. The radio provided another update that made Sarah's blood run cold. Shots fired at 418 Maple. Officer down, repeat, officer down. Requesting immediate medical assistance. The matter-of-fact tone couldn't disguise the urgency of the situation. One of the pursuing officers had been hit, was down somewhere in the residential complex while armed suspects remained active in the area. Medical assistance would require additional officers to secure the scene, further stretching the department's already limited resources. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her mind analyzing the tactical situation and developing potential solutions. The suspects had demonstrated they were willing to engage law enforcement directly, suggesting they were either desperate enough or trained enough to fight rather than surrender. The residential environment provided multiple hiding places and potential escape routes, making containment difficult. The downed officer created an immediate medical emergency that took priority over pursuit operations. She moved to her desk and pulled up the department's tactical database on her computer, accessing floor plans and aerial photos of the Maple Street residential complex. The system was supposed to be used only for official operations, but Sarah's access hadn't been revoked when she was reassigned to evidence management. A bureaucratic oversight that might prove useful. The complex consisted of 4 three-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with multiple entrances and exits that would make containment challenging. Underground parking provided additional escape routes. Stairwells and corridors created choke points that could favor either law enforcement or suspects, depending on positioning and tactics. Suspect spotted on the second floor of Building C, the radio reported. Patrol units establishing positions at all exits. But Sarah could see the problem immediately. With limited personnel, the patrol units would be spread too thin to maintain effective coverage of all potential escape routes. The suspects could move between buildings using connected walkways, or access the underground parking to escape entirely. What was needed was a coordinated tactical approach that anticipated suspect movements and positioned officers to intercept rather than simply react. Another transmission cut through her analysis. Medical unit requests escort to reach downed officer. Area not yet secure. The situation was escalating beyond the capabilities of standard patrol response. The injured officer needed immediate medical attention, but paramedics couldn't enter a potentially active shooter environment without tactical support. Meanwhile, the suspects remained mobile and dangerous, capable of creating additional casualties or escaping entirely. Sarah stood up from her computer, pacing the evidence room again as she processed the tactical situation. Years of training and experience were screaming at her to respond, to use her knowledge and skills to help resolve a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond control. But she was officially barred from tactical operations, relegated to evidence processing while other officers faced threats they might not be equipped to handle. The radio provided another update that confirmed her worst fears. Suspect vehicle spotted leaving the underground parking area. Black sedan, unknown license plate, heading east on Maple Street. At least one of the suspects had escaped the containment effort, was now mobile in a different vehicle, and potentially heading toward another target. The limited patrol units had been unable to effectively cover all escape routes, and the department's tactical resources were still committed to the main incident at City Hall. "All units, be advised," came Chief Morrison's voice again. "We now have multiple active situations across the city. Prioritize officer safety and civilian protection." Additional resources are being requested from neighboring departments. Sarah understood what Morrison wasn't saying directly. The department was overwhelmed, facing more simultaneous threats than it could effectively handle with available personnel. Requesting mutual aid from other departments would help eventually, but it would take time for those resources to arrive and be briefed on the situations. Time that might not be available if the threats continued to evolve. She returned to her computer and accessed the department's real-time deployment system, trying to understand how resources were being allocated across the various incidents. The main SWAT team was still engaged at City Hall with the hostage situation. Patrol units were spread across the pursuit and containment operations. Detectives were being pulled from their normal duties to assist with perimeter control and civilian evacuations. What became clear was that the department lacked the tactical depth to handle multiple sophisticated threats simultaneously. The suspects had either planned for this situation or had gotten lucky, but the result was the same. Law enforcement was being forced to react to threats rather than anticipate and control them. Another radio transmission brought news that made the situation even more complex. "Command, we have reports of suspicious activity at the downtown Federal Building, possible related to the City Hall incident." A potential third location. Sarah's tactical mind immediately recognized the pattern. If the suspects were coordinating attacks on multiple government buildings, they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than a simple armed robbery or domestic terrorism incident. This suggested advanced planning, inside knowledge, and resources that exceeded typical criminal capabilities. "Units responding to Federal Building report," dispatch acknowledged. "Recommend evacuation procedures for surrounding area." But Sarah knew that the department simply didn't have enough personnel to effectively handle 3 simultaneous high-threat situations. Officers were already being pulled from routine patrol duties, leaving large areas of the city with minimal coverage. The suspects seemed to understand this, seemed to be deliberately forcing law enforcement to spread resources too thin to be effective. She accessed the personnel database and confirmed what she suspected. The department was operating at about 60% of normal staffing due to the multiple deployments. Routine calls for service were being delayed, backup response times were extended, and tactical operations were being conducted with minimal safety margins. The radio crackled with another urgent transmission. "Officer at Maple Street Complex reports movement in Building D. Suspects may be regrouping for another escape attempt." The pattern was becoming clear. The suspects weren't just running randomly. They were making coordinated movements designed to exploit gaps in law enforcement coverage. They understood police tactics and response protocols well enough to stay ahead of containment efforts. This wasn't desperation. It was professional-level tactical thinking. Sarah found herself standing at the evidence room door, her hand on the handle, every instinct telling her to respond to a situation where her skills and experience could make a crucial difference. But opening that door would mean violating direct orders, challenging the departmental decision that had ended her SWAT career, and potentially facing criminal charges for interfering with an ongoing operation. The radio provided another update that made her decision more urgent. "Shots fired at Federal Building, multiple units responding. Unknown number of suspects inside." Quote, 3 active situations, all requiring tactical expertise that the department was struggling to provide. Sarah understood that officers were going to die if something didn't change quickly. Good people who were trying their best with insufficient resources and training were being asked to handle threats that exceeded their capabilities. She opened the evidence room door and stepped into the hallway, her decision made. Whatever the consequences might be for her career or her freedom, she couldn't stand by and listen to fellow officers face overwhelming odds while she possessed knowledge and skills that might save lives. The hallway was nearly empty, most officers having been deployed to one of the active incidents. Sarah moved quickly toward the equipment room where her tactical gear was still stored, officially sealed pending final disposition of her disciplinary case. The lock on her equipment locker had been changed, but Sarah knew the building's security systems well enough to find alternative access. She was retrieving her tactical vest when footsteps echoed in the corridor behind her. Sarah turned to find Detective Rodriguez approaching with a concerned expression, his own gear bag slung over his shoulder. "Chen, what are you doing?" he asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "What needs to be done?" Sarah replied, checking her equipment with practiced efficiency. How many officers do we have down? Rodriguez hesitated before answering. 2 at Maple Street, condition unknown. Federal building is still being assessed. City Hall. He paused. City Hall is getting worse. Sarah understood. The main hostage situation was deteriorating while secondary incidents strained the department's ability to respond effectively. The tactical situation had moved beyond normal police capabilities and was approaching the kind of crisis that could overwhelm even a well-resourced department. Rodriguez, she said, shouldering her gear bag, you can walk away from this conversation. Pretend you never saw me. No one will blame you for following orders. Rodriguez studied her face for a long moment, then shook his head. Morrison's at City Hall. Most of the command staff is committed to the various incidents. Chain of command is pretty thin right now. The implication was clear. In the chaos of multiple tactical situations, unofficial actions might go unnoticed long enough to make a difference. And if those actions proved successful, they might be retroactively forgiven or overlooked. It was a risk, but it was also an opportunity. I'm heading to Maple Street, Sarah said. The tactical situation there is manageable if someone coordinates the response properly. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I'll be monitoring radio traffic. If anyone asks, this conversation never happened. Sarah appreciated the gesture, even though she knew Rodriguez was taking a significant risk by not reporting her actions immediately. Department loyalty was expected to override personal relationships, but in crisis situations, the lines sometimes blurred. She made her way to the precinct's rear exit, avoiding the main desk where her departure would be logged and questioned. The building felt strange and empty, most of its normal occupants deployed across the city dealing with unprecedented threats. The evidence room that had been her world for 6 months now seemed like a memory from another life. Outside, the late afternoon air carried the distant sound of sirens and the weight of a city under siege. Sarah climbed into her personal vehicle, a decision that would technically make her a civilian volunteer rather than an officer acting under department authority. Another line crossed, another bridge burned in the service of doing what she believed was right. As she drove toward Maple Street, Sarah's radio continued to provide updates from the various incident scenes. The tactical situation was fluid and complex, requiring the kind of coordinated response that the department was struggling to provide with stretched resources and improvised command structures. But Sarah had been trained for exactly this kind of chaos, had learned to find patterns in apparent randomness and create order from tactical confusion. For the first time in 6 months, she felt like she was moving toward her true purpose, rather than away from it. The question now was whether her unofficial intervention would be seen as heroic necessity or unforgivable insubordination. The answer would depend largely on results, and results would depend on her ability to use her tactical skills to save lives in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond official control. Sarah Chen was about to discover whether 6 months of forced irrelevance had dulled her edge or only sharpened her resolve. The drive to Maple Street took Sarah through neighborhoods that looked deceptively normal, despite the chaos unfolding across the city. Children were being hurried inside by worried parents who had caught fragments of news reports, but most civilians remained unaware of how close danger had come to their doorsteps. The radio chatter in Sarah's ear painted a different picture entirely, one of coordinated violence and law enforcement struggling to maintain control. She parked 3 blocks away from the residential complex, close enough to respond quickly but far enough to avoid immediate detection by command staff who might order her to stand down. The tactical vest felt familiar against her chest, the weight distribution exactly as she remembered from countless operations. Her sidearm rode in its holster with the comfortable presence of a tool that had never failed her when lives depended on accuracy. The scene at Maple Street was controlled chaos. Patrol cars formed a loose perimeter around the residential complex, their red and blue lights creating an intermittent aurora against the late afternoon sky. Officers moved between positions with the careful urgency of people operating in a potentially lethal environment, but Sarah could see immediately that their positioning was reactive rather than strategic. She approached on foot, staying low and using parked cars for concealment. Years of tactical training had taught her to read a scene quickly, to identify strengths and weaknesses in defensive positions, to understand how threats might develop and how they could be countered. What she saw at Maple Street was a textbook example of insufficient resources trying to handle a situation that required tactical expertise. The wounded officer was still down in the courtyard between buildings C and D, visible through the gaps in patrol car positioning but unreachable due to unknown suspect locations. Paramedics waited behind the outer perimeter, their medical equipment ready but useless until the area could be secured. Every minute of delay increased the risk of permanent injury or death, but rushing forward without proper tactical support would likely create additional casualties. Sarah's trained eye cataloged the various problems with the current response. Patrol officers were positioned to prevent suspects from leaving the complex, but they weren't coordinated enough to prevent movement between buildings. Communication appeared to be happening through individual radio calls, rather than centralized command control. Most critically, no one seemed to have a comprehensive understanding of the building layouts or optimal positioning for tactical advantage. She circled around to the east side of the complex, where she had a clear view of the underground parking entrance that had allowed at least one suspect to escape earlier. 2 patrol officers were positioned there now, but they were standing in the open rather than using available cover, and their angle of observation was limited by the entrance ramp's configuration. Detective Martinez appeared from behind a patrol car, his expression tense, as he coordinated with other responding officers. Sarah recognized him as competent but inexperienced with tactical operations, the kind of officer who would follow orders effectively but might not see the larger strategic picture. He was talking into his radio when he spotted Sarah approaching. His face went through a rapid series of expressions. Surprise at seeing her in tactical gear, confusion about her presence at an active scene, and something that might have been relief at seeing someone with specialized training. Martinez glanced around quickly, ensuring no senior officers were in immediate proximity, then moved to intercept her. "Chen, what the hell are you doing here?" he whispered urgently. "Morrison finds out you're on scene. You're looking at criminal charges." Sarah nodded, understanding the risk but focused on more immediate concerns. "What's the tactical situation? How many suspects are still in the complex?" Martinez hesitated for a moment, then his professional instincts overcame departmental politics. "Unknown number, at least 2 confirmed in Building D. We lost radio contact with Officer Williams when he went down in the courtyard. Suspects are armed with high-powered rifles, body armor, the whole package." Sarah studied the building configuration, comparing what she could see with the floor plan she had reviewed in the evidence room. Building D was the northeastern structure, with multiple entrances and a connection to the underground parking system. If suspects were holed up there, they had several escape routes and good defensive positions. "Who's running tactical command?" she asked. Martinez grimaced. "Sergeant Cooper, but he's coordinating from the outer perimeter. No one has eyes on the interior, and we're not sure about civilian status in the other buildings." Sarah understood the problem immediately. Cooper was a good patrol supervisor, but he had limited tactical training, and was trying to manage a complex operation from a position where he couldn't assess the evolving situation. It was a command structure born of necessity rather than planning, and it was inadequate for the threats they were facing. A burst of automatic weapons fire erupted from Building D, the sharp cracks echoing off the surrounding structures. The patrol officers instinctively took cover, but their positions were awkward and exposed. 2 more shots followed, more precise and aimed, suggesting the suspects were engaging specific targets rather than firing randomly. "Officer Williams is still moving," Martinez reported after checking his radio, "but he's pinned down in the courtyard. Medical says he needs evacuation within the next 10 minutes, or we're looking at permanent damage." Sarah's tactical mind began working through the variables. 10 minutes to plan and execute a rescue operation in a hostile environment with limited personnel and no direct tactical support. The kind of time constraint that required immediate action rather than extended planning. The kind of situation where hesitation killed people. She moved to a position where she could observe Building D directly, noting the window patterns and potential firing positions. The suspects had chosen their location well, with good sight lines across the courtyard and multiple escape routes if the situation became untenable. But their defensive advantages also created vulnerabilities if approached from unexpected angles. "Martinez," she said quietly, "I need you to patch me into the tactical frequency." Martinez looked uncomfortable. "Chen, I can't authorize that." You're not supposed to be here, and if command finds out, I'm helping you. Officer Williams is going to die if we don't do something in the next few minutes, Sarah interrupted. You can worry about regulations later, or you can help me save his life now. Martinez stared at her for a long moment, then pulled out his backup radio and handed it to her. Channel 7, he said quietly. But this conversation never happened. Sarah switched to the tactical frequency and listened to the radio traffic for 30 seconds, getting a feel for how information was flowing and who was making decisions. Sergeant Cooper's voice dominated the communications, but he was asking questions rather than giving orders, trying to gather information from patrol officers who had limited visibility into the complex. She keyed the radio and spoke in the calm, professional tone that had once been her trademark during tactical operations. Command. This is an additional tactical asset on scene. Request permission to provide situation assessment. The radio went quiet for several seconds. Then Cooper's voice returned, cautious but interested. Identify yourself, tactical asset. Sarah paused, knowing that her next words would either open a door or end her unofficial involvement entirely. This is Detective Chen, formerly SWAT tactical specialist. I have eyes on Building D and recommend immediate action for officer rescue. Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could imagine the rapid conversations happening at the command post, the quick decisions being made about whether to accept help from an officer who was officially in disgrace. Finally, Cooper's voice returned. Chen, what's your assessment? Sarah felt a familiar surge of professional focus as she shifted into tactical mode. Suspects are positioned on the second floor northeast corner of Building D. They have good defensive positioning but limited mobility due to their weapons and equipment. Officer Williams is in the courtyard approximately 40 meters from the building entrance, conscious but unable to move to cover. She paused, studying the tactical situation and developing a rescue plan in real time. Recommend coordinated approach using smoke concealment and multiple access points. We can extract Williams and neutralize the threat simultaneously if we move quickly. Negative, Chen, Cooper replied immediately. We're maintaining perimeter until SWAT becomes available. Too much risk for untrained personnel. But Sarah knew that SWAT wouldn't be available for at least another hour, and Officer Williams didn't have that much time. The suspects weren't going to wait passively for law enforcement to develop an overwhelming tactical advantage. They would either escape through one of their prepared routes or escalate the situation by taking additional hostages. She studied the building layout again, noting the position of patrol officers and the angles of observation available to the suspects. There was a service entrance on the west side of Building D that appeared to be unmonitored, probably because Cooper didn't have enough personnel to cover all possible access points. If someone could reach that entrance undetected, they could potentially access the building's stairwell system and approach the suspects from an unexpected direction. Command, she radioed again. Request permission to attempt solo reconnaissance of Building D West entrance. No engagement, information gathering only. Another pause. Sarah could hear other radio traffic in the background, updates from the various incidents across the city that were straining department resources. Cooper was dealing with multiple problems simultaneously, trying to coordinate responses that exceeded available capabilities. Chen, negative on solo reconnaissance, maintain observation position, and provide tactical advice only. But Sarah was already moving, using the cover of parked cars and landscaping to work her way toward the west side of the complex. Martinez saw her movement and shook his head, but he didn't try to stop her or report her position. Sometimes the gap between official orders and operational necessity required individual judgment calls. The service entrance was exactly where the building plans had indicated, an unmarked door that provided access to the building's utility areas and stairwell system. Sarah approached carefully, checking for signs of suspect surveillance or defensive preparations. The door was unlocked, probably overlooked by the suspects who were focused on the main entrances and the courtyard area. She paused at the threshold, understanding that crossing it would represent another escalation in her unofficial involvement. Once inside the building, she would be in potential direct contact with armed suspects, operating without backup or official sanction. If something went wrong, there would be no rescue coming and no official explanation for her presence. Sarah opened the door and stepped inside. The building's interior was dimly lit, with the institutional smell of cleaning products and old carpet that characterized low-income housing. She moved through a utility corridor that connected to the main stairwell, her footsteps silent on the worn linoleum flooring. Years of tactical training had taught her to move through unknown buildings efficiently, to identify potential threats and escape routes, to maintain situational awareness in confined spaces. The stairwell was empty but filled with the echoes of movement from the floors above. Sarah could hear voices, male and speaking in calm, professional tones that suggested military or law enforcement training. These weren't panicked criminals. They were individuals operating according to a plan, with defined objectives and prepared responses to law enforcement tactics. She climbed to the second-floor landing and paused to listen. The voices were clearer now, coming from somewhere near the northeast corner of the building, where her external observation had suggested the suspects were positioned. Two distinct speakers, possibly a third who was less vocal. The conversation was too quiet to make out specific words, but the rhythm suggested tactical coordination rather than casual discussion. Sarah accessed the floor plan on her phone, using the building management database to identify the apartment layout and potential positioning of the suspects. Unit 2D was in the northeast corner, a two-bedroom apartment with windows overlooking the courtyard where Officer Williams was still pinned down. If the suspects were using that unit as their defensive position, they would have good sightlines but limited escape routes. She moved carefully down the hallway, staying close to the wall and checking each apartment door as she passed. Most showed signs of recent evacuation, probably civilian residents who had fled when the shooting started. But Unit 2D had its door slightly ajar, with tactical equipment visible in the gap. Definitely the suspect's position. Sarah's radio crackled softly in her earpiece. All units be advised. Suspect movement detected in Building D, unknown intentions. She realized the suspects were probably preparing for their next move, either an escape attempt or an escalation that would create additional casualties. The controlled way they had been operating suggested they weren't planning to surrender peacefully, and their demonstrated willingness to engage law enforcement directly made them extremely dangerous. A new voice came over the radio, older and more authoritative than the patrol officers who had been providing most of the communications. "This is Chief Morrison. I'm en route to Maple Street with additional tactical resources. All units maintain defensive positions until I arrive." Sarah's stomach tightened. Morrison's arrival would mean the end of her unofficial involvement, and probably criminal charges for violating her assignment restrictions. But it also meant that Officer Williams would have to wait even longer for rescue, and the suspects would have additional time to plan their next move. She heard footsteps in the apartment, movement that suggested the suspects were gathering their equipment and preparing to relocate. If they moved to a different position in the complex, the tactical situation would reset, and Williams would remain pinned down indefinitely. This might be the only opportunity to act before the suspects gained additional advantages. Sarah moved closer to the apartment door, trying to get a better assessment of the number of suspects and their equipment status. Through the gap, she could see tactical gear and weapons that confirmed these were serious professionals rather than ordinary criminals. Military-style rifles, body armor, communications equipment, the kind of resources that suggested significant planning and support. One of the voices became clearer as someone moved near the door. "Phase 2 in 30 seconds. Everyone ready?" Phase 2. Sarah's tactical mind immediately understood the implications. These suspects weren't just holed up defensively. They were operating according to a planned sequence of actions. Phase 2 probably meant movement to a new position, or escalation to additional targets. Either way, it represented a deterioration of the tactical situation that needed to be prevented. She keyed her radio and whispered as quietly as possible. "Command, suspects in Unit 2D are preparing to move. Recommend immediate action to prevent tactical repositioning." Cooper's response was immediate and sharp. "Jen, what's your location? Are you inside the building?" Before Sarah could respond, the apartment door opened fully and one of the suspects stepped into the hallway. He was dressed in military-style clothing with tactical gear that marked him as serious professional. More importantly, he was carrying an assault rifle and moving with the confident purpose of someone executing a planned operation. He saw Sarah immediately, his weapon beginning to come up in her direction. Years of tactical training compressed into a single moment of recognition and response. The suspect was armed, hostile, and positioned to threaten both Sarah and Officer Williams in the courtyard below. There was no time for warnings or negotiations. Sarah drew her sidearm and fired a single shot. The round struck the suspect's center mass, stopping his movement and dropping his weapon. He fell backward into the apartment doorway, his tactical gear clattering against the floor. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the building, followed immediately by shouts from inside the apartment as the remaining suspects reacted to the unexpected engagement. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" Sarah radioed, her training taking over completely. One suspect down. Unknown number still active in Unit 2D. The radio exploded with urgent communications as the tactical situation shifted dramatically. Sarah had crossed the line from observation to active engagement, creating the kind of decisive moment that would either save lives or create a catastrophic escalation. Movement erupted from inside the apartment as the remaining suspects responded to their partner's fall. Sarah could hear equipment being moved rapidly, voices calling out tactical instructions, the sound of people preparing for either aggressive action or rapid escape. She had disrupted their planned timeline, but she had also revealed her position and committed herself to direct confrontation. "Chen, report your status." Cooper's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Do you need backup?" Sarah pressed herself against the hallway wall, trying to maintain tactical advantage while assessing the immediate threat level. The apartment had gone quiet after the initial burst of activity, which could mean the suspects were preparing an ambush or planning an escape through one of the building's other access points. "One suspect neutralized," she reported. "Unknown number still active. They were preparing to move to Phase 2 of their operation." Another voice cut into the radio traffic, and Sarah recognized Chief Morrison's tone even through the static. "Chen, you are ordered to withdraw immediately. You are not authorized for tactical engagement." But withdrawal was no longer a tactical option. Sarah was positioned between the remaining suspects and one of their primary escape routes. If she moved now, she would give them freedom of movement that could result in additional casualties or their complete escape from the complex. Officer Williams was still pinned down in the courtyard, and medical assistance remained impossible until the threat was neutralized. A window broke somewhere in the apartment, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground outside. Sarah realized the suspects were attempting escape through the windows, probably using rope or rappelling equipment to reach the courtyard level. It was a desperate move that would leave them exposed, but might allow them to reach Williams' position and use him as a human shield. She moved quickly to the apartment doorway, stepping over the fallen suspect and positioning herself to observe the interior. The apartment was in chaos, with tactical equipment scattered and furniture overturned. A rope was hanging from the broken window, confirming that at least one suspect had already descended to the courtyard level. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent reports from the perimeter officers. Suspect on the ground level, moving toward the wounded officer. Armed and extremely dangerous. The tactical situation had become fluid and unpredictable, exactly the kind of scenario that required immediate decision-making rather than lengthy planning. Sarah could wait for backup and risk Williams being taken hostage, or she could continue her unauthorized engagement and attempt to neutralize the remaining threats. She moved to the broken window and looked down into the courtyard. One suspect was indeed moving toward Williams' position, using tactical movement techniques that suggested military training. He was carrying a rifle and moving with the purposeful confidence of someone executing a planned operation rather than fleeing in panic. Officer Williams was conscious but clearly injured, unable to move effectively or defend himself. The approaching suspect would reach him within seconds, at which point the tactical situation would become a hostage scenario that could last for hours and probably end in multiple casualties. Sarah braced herself against the window frame and lined up her shot. The range was approximately 50 meters, with a slight downward angle that complicated the ballistics but remained within her demonstrated capabilities. The suspect was moving but in a predictable pattern, following tactical procedures that made his path somewhat predictable. She controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect, striking the suspect's center mass and dropping him immediately. He fell less than 10 feet from Williams' position, his weapon clattering across the concrete courtyard. The threat to the wounded officer was neutralized, and the immediate tactical crisis was resolved. But Sarah's position at the window had exposed her to observation from the other buildings in the complex, and she immediately realized that additional suspects might be positioned where they could engage her. She moved away from the window quickly, taking cover behind the apartment's interior walls while assessing whether any additional threats remained active. Her radio erupted with communications as the situation developed rapidly. Suspect down in the courtyard. Medical personnel, you are clear to approach the wounded officer. Chief Morrison's voice cut through the chatter with unmistakable authority and anger. Chen, you are ordered to exit the building immediately and report to my position. You are under arrest for disobeying direct orders and interfering with a tactical operation. Sarah understood that her career in law enforcement was effectively over, but Officer Williams was alive and would receive the medical attention he needed. The immediate threat to civilian residents of the complex had been neutralized, and the suspect's planned Phase 2 operation had been disrupted. From a tactical perspective, the engagement had been successful. She secured her weapon and began moving toward the building's exit, knowing that she would face serious criminal charges for her unauthorized actions. But as she walked through the building's corridors, her radio provided updates that confirmed the value of her intervention. Officer Williams is conscious and responsive. Medical personnel report his injuries are serious but not life-threatening. Building D has been cleared. No additional suspects located. Recovery of suspect equipment reveals evidence of planned attacks on multiple government facilities. Sarah reached the building's main entrance and stepped outside into the controlled chaos of the expanded crime scene. Medical personnel were loading Williams into an ambulance, while crime scene technicians began processing evidence from the apartment and courtyard. The tactical situation that had seemed overwhelming an hour earlier was now under control. Chief Morrison was waiting for her near the command post, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been grudging respect. He was flanked by 2 patrol officers who were clearly prepared to place her under arrest, but he held up a hand to delay their action. Chen, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority and difficult decisions. You realize what you've done here. Sarah nodded, understanding that Morrison was referring to more than just the tactical engagement. She had openly defied departmental authority, violated the terms of her disciplinary assignment, and taken unauthorized action that could have resulted in additional casualties. From an administrative perspective, her actions were indefensible. Yes, sir, she replied simply. I understand. Morrison studied her face for a long moment, then glanced toward the ambulance where Williams was receiving medical treatment. The preliminary assessment suggests that your intervention prevented the suspects from taking Williams hostage and potentially escaping to attack additional targets. Sarah waited, knowing that Morrison was working through the complex calculus of departmental politics, legal liability, and operational results. Her actions had been successful from a tactical standpoint, but they had also represented a direct challenge to his authority and the disciplinary system he was responsible for maintaining. Detective Martinez, Morrison called, and the officer approached with obvious reluctance. Did you provide assistance to Detective Chen during this operation? Martinez hesitated for only a moment before answering. Yes, sir. I provided radio access when she requested it. Morrison nodded slowly, processing the information and its implications. Multiple officers had been aware of Sarah's presence and had chosen not to report it immediately, suggesting that the unofficial support for her actions extended beyond just Martinez. Sir, Martinez continued, Detective Chen's tactical assessment and actions directly resulted in the successful resolution of this incident. Without her intervention, we would likely be dealing with a hostage situation and additional casualties. Morrison turned back to Sarah, his expression unreadable. Your actions today were completely unauthorized and in direct violation of your current assignment. They also demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking and decision-making that this department desperately needs. Sarah understood that Morrison was facing the same kind of impossible choice she had confronted in the apartment building. Following regulations and procedures that didn't account for the reality of the situation, or making decisions based on operational necessity and accepting the administrative consequences. Chief, she said quietly, I take full responsibility for my actions. Detective Martinez and the other officers were following their best judgment in a crisis situation. Morrison was quiet for several seconds, watching as crime scene technicians continued to process evidence from the tactical engagement. Finally, he spoke in a tone that suggested he had reached a difficult decision. "Detective Chen, you are suspended pending a full investigation of your actions today. You will surrender your weapon and badge and report to Internal Affairs tomorrow morning for formal questioning." Sarah nodded, unsurprised by the decision. She had known the probable consequences of her actions before she entered Building D, and she accepted them as the price of doing what she believed was necessary. But Morrison wasn't finished. However, he continued, "I am also recommending that the review board consider your actions in the context of the overall tactical situation and the successful resolution of a complex threat scenario." The implication was clear. While Sarah would face official discipline for her unauthorized actions, Morrison was providing a pathway for the department to recognize the value of what she had accomplished. It was a political solution that acknowledged both the reality of her insubordination and the effectiveness of her tactical intervention. As Sarah prepared to surrender her badge and weapon, her radio provided one final update that put the entire incident in perspective. "Command, federal authorities are reporting that materials recovered from the suspects indicate a planned coordinated attack on multiple government facilities. The disruption of their timeline may have prevented significant casualties." Sarah handed her badge to Chief Morrison, understanding that her law enforcement career was entering a new and uncertain phase. But Officer Williams was alive. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and a larger terrorist plot had been disrupted. From her perspective, those results justified whatever personal consequences she would face. Morrison accepted her badge with a nod that conveyed more respect than his official words could express. "Chen," he said quietly, "we'll be in touch." As Sarah walked away from the Maple Street complex, she could hear the ongoing radio traffic coordinating the response to the various incidents across the city. The crisis that had overwhelmed the department's resources was gradually being brought under control, and the city was returning to something approaching normal operations. But for Sarah Chen, nothing would ever be normal again. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had made a choice that would define the rest of her career. The question now was whether the department would find a way to value her unique combination of skills and judgment, or whether her willingness to act outside official channels would make her permanently unsuitable for law enforcement work. The answer would depend on factors beyond her control: politics, liability concerns, and the complicated relationship between individual initiative and institutional authority. But Sarah had made her choice based on the only criteria that ultimately mattered to her. When lives were on the line and immediate action was required, she had responded according to her training and her conscience rather than her assignment restrictions. Whatever came next, she could live with that decision. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in the sterile conference room of the Internal Affairs Division, watching afternoon sunlight filter through institutional blinds that hadn't been cleaned in months. The room smelled of old coffee and bureaucratic anxiety, with that particular blend of industrial carpet and recycled air that characterized administrative spaces throughout the police department. She'd been here 4 times now, each session a careful dissection of her actions at Maple Street, each question designed to establish either criminal culpability or justifiable response under extraordinary circumstances. Across the table, Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Hayes from the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force was reviewing documents with the kind of methodical attention that suggested every detail mattered. Hayes had arrived 2 days after the Maple Street incident, bringing federal resources and a perspective that elevated the entire situation from local police matter to national security concern. Her presence had shifted the internal investigation from a simple disciplinary review to something far more complex and politically sensitive. Deputy Chief Patricia Kellerman sat beside Hayes, her own stack of files representing the department's internal assessment of Sarah's actions. Kellerman was known throughout the department as someone who played politics carefully but fairly, who understood the balance between institutional authority and operational reality. Her involvement suggested that Chief Morrison was taking the review seriously and wanted input from officers who understood both tactical operations and administrative consequences. Sarah's attorney, Michael Davidson, occupied the chair to her left with the relaxed confidence of someone who specialized in law enforcement disciplinary cases. Davidson had reviewed every aspect of the incident and had concluded that while Sarah's actions were technically insubordinate, they fell within the legal parameters of justified response to imminent threat. His presence was more procedural than protective at this point, since the investigation had evolved beyond simple disciplinary action. "Detective Chen," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials on matters of national importance. "I want to review your tactical assessment of the suspect's capabilities and intentions. Your observations have proven remarkably accurate in light of subsequent intelligence." Sarah nodded. Understanding that Hayes was approaching the incident from a counter-terrorism perspective rather than internal police discipline. The materials recovered from the suspects had revealed connections to a larger network of domestic terrorists who had been planning coordinated attacks on government facilities across multiple cities. Sarah's intervention had disrupted not just a local crisis, but a significant national security threat. "The suspects demonstrated professional-level tactical training," Sarah began, organizing her thoughts around the key observations that had guided her decision-making. "Their equipment, movement patterns, and communication protocols indicated military or law enforcement background. They weren't operating as individual criminals, but as part of a coordinated unit with specific objectives and predetermined fallback positions." Hayes made notes on her tablet, occasionally glancing at Deputy Chief Kellerman to gauge her reaction. "Your assessment led you to conclude that immediate intervention was necessary rather than waiting for additional tactical resources. Can you explain that decision-making process?" This was the critical question that had driven the entire investigation. Sarah's unauthorized actions could only be justified if the tactical situation had truly required immediate response. If waiting for proper authorization and backup would have resulted in significantly worse outcomes. The answer would determine whether she faced criminal charges or departmental commendation. "The suspects were operating according to a planned timeline," Sarah explained. Their reference to Phase 2 indicated they were preparing to move to predetermined secondary positions or targets. Based on their equipment and tactical capabilities, any delay in response would have given them additional advantages and potentially resulted in multiple casualties. Deputy Chief Kellerman leaned forward slightly, her expression indicating she was processing Sarah's explanation in the context of departmental policies and procedures. "Detective Chen, you made these assessments and took decisive action without consulting with the incident commander or requesting additional resources. That represents a significant departure from established protocols." Sarah understood the administrative perspective that Kellerman was required to maintain. Police departments functioned on hierarchical command structures that ensured coordination and accountability during complex operations. Individual officers couldn't simply decide to override those structures, even when their tactical assessment suggested different approaches might be more effective. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah acknowledged. "I understood that my actions violated established protocols, but the tactical situation was evolving too rapidly for normal command consultation, and Officer Williams needed immediate assistance." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes set down her tablet and studied Sarah with the kind of direct attention that suggested she was making important assessments about character and judgment. "Detective Chen, the materials we recovered from the suspects included detailed plans for attacks on federal buildings in 6 different cities. The timeline they were following would have resulted in coordinated strikes designed to maximize casualties and create widespread terror." The room went quiet as Hayes paused to let the implications sink in. Sarah had known that the incident was significant, but hearing the scope of the planned attacks put her actions in a different context entirely. Her intervention hadn't just saved Officer Williams and prevented local casualties. It had disrupted a major terrorist operation with national implications. "Your tactical assessment and immediate response may have prevented one of the most significant domestic terrorism attacks in recent history," Hayes continued. "The suspects' communications indicate they were under strict orders to maintain their timeline regardless of local law enforcement response. Your disruption of that timeline forced them to abort their coordinated operation." Deputy Chief Kellerman was reviewing her own files, comparing Sarah's actions against department policy and legal precedent. "The federal assessment is certainly relevant to our evaluation," she said carefully. "But we also have to consider the precedent that Detective Chen's actions might set for other officers facing similar situations." This was the core administrative concern that had complicated the entire review process. If the department officially sanctioned Sarah's unauthorized actions, it might encourage other officers to disregard command authority when they believed their tactical assessment was superior. The result could be chaos during complex operations, with individual officers making independent decisions that undermined coordinated response efforts. Sarah's attorney spoke for the first time during the current session. With respect, Deputy Chief Kellerman, Detective Chen's actions fall within established legal precedent for law enforcement response to imminent threat. The specific circumstances of this incident don't create a broad precedent for ignoring command authority. Davidson had clearly prepared his argument carefully, focusing on the legal justification for Sarah's actions rather than the departmental policy implications. His approach suggested confidence that the criminal aspects of the investigation would be resolved favorably, leaving only administrative consequences to be determined. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes returned to her questioning, focusing on tactical details that would help federal authorities understand the broader terrorist network. Detective Chen, you mentioned that the suspect's communication protocols suggested coordination with external command authority. Can you describe what you observed? Sarah thought back to the brief conversation she had overheard in the apartment building, recalling details that had seemed routine at the time but took on greater significance in light of the federal investigation. They were receiving instructions rather than making independent tactical decisions. Someone with authority over their operation was providing real-time guidance, probably through encrypted communications. This information clearly interested Hayes, who made extensive notes while asking follow-up questions about timing, communication equipment, and behavioral patterns. The federal investigation was using Sarah's observations to build a comprehensive picture of how the terrorist network operated, information that could be crucial for preventing future attacks. The questioning continued for another hour, covering every aspect of Sarah's tactical assessment and response. Hayes was particularly interested in Sarah's ability to read the suspect's intentions and anticipate their next moves, skills that had allowed her to position herself effectively and take decisive action at critical moments. Detective Chen, Hayes said as the formal questioning concluded, "Your tactical acumen and decision-making under pressure are exactly the kind of capabilities that federal law enforcement needs for counterterrorism operations. Have you ever considered a career with federal agencies?" The question was unexpected but not entirely surprising. Sarah had heard that federal agencies often recruited from local law enforcement, looking for officers with proven tactical skills and the kind of judgment that couldn't be taught in training programs. But she had never seriously considered leaving local police work, had always seen her role as serving the community where she lived and worked. "I hadn't considered it," Sarah replied honestly. "My focus has always been on local law enforcement." Deputy Chief Kellerman was watching this exchange with obvious interest, understanding that federal recruitment of Sarah would solve several problems for the local department. If Sarah moved to federal employment, the administrative complications of her unauthorized actions would become someone else's responsibility, while the department could claim credit for training an officer valuable enough to attract federal interest. Hayes handed Sarah a business card with federal contact information. "I'd like you to consider it seriously. The Joint Terrorism Task Force needs officers with your combination of tactical expertise and analytical thinking. Your actions at Maple Street demonstrate exactly the kind of initiative and judgment we're looking for." The formal interview session concluded with administrative details about the ongoing investigation and timelines for final decisions. Sarah would remain on administrative leave pending completion of the review, but the tone of the proceedings had shifted significantly from disciplinary action toward career planning and future opportunities. As the participants gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Deputy Chief Kellerman asked Sarah to remain for a private conversation. After Hayes and Davidson had departed, Kellerman closed the conference room door and returned to her seat with the expression of someone preparing to have a difficult but important discussion. "Chen," she began, "I need to give you some context about the political situation surrounding your case. Chief Morrison is facing significant pressure from multiple directions, and your future with the department depends on factors beyond just the tactical success of your actions." Sarah listened carefully, understanding that Kellerman was providing insider information that could influence her decision-making about federal opportunities or other career options. The deputy chief had a reputation for straight talk and fair dealing, qualities that made her assessment particularly valuable. The mayor's office is concerned about liability issues if the department officially endorses unauthorized tactical actions, Kellerman continued. City legal is worried about wrongful death lawsuits if other officers follow your example and the results are less favorable. There's pressure to discipline you severely as a deterrent to future unauthorized actions. But Kellerman wasn't finished with her assessment. On the other hand, the successful disruption of a major terrorist plot makes you a departmental hero in many circles. The media coverage has been overwhelmingly positive, and several city council members have publicly praised your actions. Morrison is caught between conflicting pressures that make any decision politically complicated. Sarah understood the impossible position that Chief Morrison faced. Supporting her actions could be seen as encouraging insubordination, but punishing the officer who had prevented a terrorist attack could be seen as prioritizing bureaucracy over public safety. Either decision would create political problems that could affect Morrison's career and the department's reputation. "What's your assessment of the likely outcome?" Sarah asked, appreciating Kellerman's willingness to provide honest analysis of a complex situation. Kellerman was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. "I think Morrison will find a middle path that acknowledges both the success of your actions and the importance of maintaining command authority. You probably won't face criminal charges, but you also won't return to SWAT in your previous capacity." The prediction was consistent with Sarah's own assessment of the political dynamics surrounding her case. The department needed to maintain the appearance of discipline while avoiding the public relations disaster that would result from severely punishing an officer who had prevented terrorism and saved lives. The federal opportunity that Lieutenant Colonel Hayes mentioned might be the best resolution for everyone involved, Kellerman continued. It would allow you to use your skills in an appropriate setting while resolving the administrative complications for the local department. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic of the suggestion but feeling conflicted about leaving local law enforcement. She had always seen herself as part of the community she served, connected to the neighborhoods and people who depended on police protection. Federal work would be important and challenging, but it would also be more distant from the immediate human connections that had drawn her to police work. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. Chief Morrison entered with a measured stride of someone carrying significant responsibility and difficult decisions. His expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about the conclusions he had reached regarding Sarah's case. "Deputy Chief Kellerman, Detective Chen," he said formally, taking a seat across from them. "I wanted to discuss the resolution of this investigation before making any public announcements." Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly, understanding that Morrison was about to deliver decisions that would determine the trajectory of her career and possibly her freedom. The weeks of uncertainty and administrative review were about to conclude with consequences that could range from criminal prosecution to departmental commendation. Morrison opened a folder containing what appeared to be official documents, his demeanor suggesting he had spent considerable time developing his approach to this moment. "Detective Chen, after extensive review of your actions at Maple Street and consultation with federal authorities, I have reached several conclusions about appropriate administrative action." The formal tone indicated that Morrison was speaking for the record, probably with knowledge that his words would be scrutinized by media, politicians, and departmental oversight authorities. Sarah prepared herself for decisions that had been carefully crafted to balance competing interests and political pressures. "First," Morrison began, "the investigation has concluded that your tactical assessment of the threat situation was accurate, and that your actions directly prevented significant casualties and disrupted a major terrorist operation. Your judgment under pressure and tactical execution were exemplary." Sarah felt a measure of relief at this official acknowledgement, but she understood that Morrison's assessment would include both positive and negative elements designed to satisfy various constituencies. "However," Morrison continued, "your decision to act without authorization and outside your assigned duties represents a serious breach of departmental protocols that cannot be overlooked without undermining command authority and operational discipline." This was the expected counterbalance, the administrative criticism that would justify whatever disciplinary action Morrison had decided to impose. Sarah waited for the specific consequences that would determine her future with the department. "Therefore," Morrison said, "I am officially reprimanding you for insubordination and unauthorized tactical engagement. This reprimand will be noted in your personnel file and will affect your eligibility for certain promotional opportunities within the department." The punishment was significant but not career-ending, representing the kind of middle ground that Kellerman had predicted. Sarah would face official consequences for her actions, but those consequences wouldn't prevent her from continuing her law enforcement career in some capacity. But Morrison wasn't finished with his announcement. I am also transferring you from evidence management to a new position with the department's crisis response unit, where your tactical expertise and analytical skills can be properly utilized under appropriate command structure. Sarah was surprised by this development, which represented not just restoration to meaningful work but promotion to a specialized unit that would allow her to use her skills effectively. The crisis response unit handled situations that required tactical thinking, but operated under closer supervision than SWAT, providing a structure that addressed administrative concerns while utilizing her capabilities. Additionally, Morrison continued, I am recommending you for the department's Medal of Valor in recognition of your actions at Maple Street. The formal presentation will occur at next month's award ceremony. The medal recommendation was unexpected and politically significant. It represented official recognition that Sarah's actions had been heroic, rather than merely insubordinate, sending a message that the department valued tactical excellence and life-saving initiative, even when those qualities created administrative complications. Deputy Chief Kellerman was making notes, clearly pleased with Morrison's approach to resolving a complex situation. The combination of official discipline and recognition created a precedent that maintained command authority while rewarding effective action under extraordinary circumstances. Chief Morrison, Sarah said, I appreciate the opportunity to continue serving with the department. The crisis response unit assignment sounds like meaningful work where I can contribute effectively. Morrison nodded, but his expression suggested he had additional information to share. Detective Chen, there's one more element to this situation that you should be aware of. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has formally requested that you be assigned as a liaison officer with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, working part-time on federal cases while maintaining your local duties. This was an unexpected development that would significantly expand Sarah's responsibilities and provide opportunities for the kind of high-level tactical work that had always motivated her. Federal liaison positions were typically reserved for senior officers with extensive experience and proven track records, making the offer a significant recognition of her capabilities. The liaison position would involve periodic deployment to other cities for counterterrorism operations, Morrison explained. It's challenging work that requires the kind of tactical thinking and quick decision-making you demonstrated at Maple Street. Sarah understood that the federal liaison opportunity represented validation of her skills at the highest levels of law enforcement. It would also provide a pathway for career advancement that might not be available within the local department due to the political complications surrounding her unauthorized actions. I'm interested in the liaison position, Sarah said. It sounds like work where I can make a significant contribution to public safety. Morrison's expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been relief or satisfaction with the resolution he had crafted. Good. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes will contact you next week to discuss training schedules and operational assignments. The conversation was interrupted by Morrison's radio, which crackled with urgent traffic about a developing situation elsewhere in the city. Sarah recognized the familiar rhythm of crisis communications, the controlled urgency that indicated law enforcement was responding to a significant threat. Active shooter at Riverside Elementary, dispatch reported. Multiple units responding, requesting tactical support. Morrison was on his feet immediately, his administrative role shifting to operational command as the department mobilized for another crisis. Kellerman, coordinate with SWAT deployment. Chen, you're with me. Sarah was surprised by Morrison's decision to include her in the response, given that her new assignment hadn't officially begun and her administrative status remained uncertain. But crisis situations had a way of cutting through bureaucratic complications, creating operational necessities that overrode normal procedures. They rushed from the conference room toward the department's Tactical Operations Center, where communications staff were coordinating the response to the school emergency. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and professional focus that came with urgent tactical situations, the heightened awareness that had made her effective during high-stakes operations. The Operations Center was controlled chaos, with multiple radio channels providing updates from responding units and coordination staff working to deploy resources effectively. Sarah found herself automatically analyzing the incoming information, building a mental picture of the tactical situation, and identifying potential complications or opportunities. Initial report indicates a single shooter in the main building, the watch commander briefed Morrison. Students and staff are being evacuated to the gymnasium. SWAT is en route, but won't arrive for another 15 minutes. 15 minutes was an eternity during an active shooter situation, particularly in a school environment where every second could mean additional casualties. Sarah understood the tactical mathematics that drove school shooting responses. Immediate action by available officers, even without tactical support, was often more effective than waiting for specialized units. Morrison was coordinating with multiple agencies while tracking the deployment of available resources. How many patrol units are on scene? 6 units currently, 4 more en route. They're establishing perimeter and beginning evacuation procedures. Sarah studied the tactical display screen that showed the school layout and current unit positions. The responding officers were following standard protocols for active shooter response, but their positioning suggested they weren't prepared for the kind of coordinated entry that might be necessary to neutralize the threat quickly. "Chief," she said quietly, "the patrol units are positioned for containment rather than immediate response. If the shooter is mobile within the building, containment won't prevent additional casualties." Morrison looked at her sharply, clearly processing her tactical assessment in the context of the crisis they were facing. "What's your recommendation?" Sarah pointed to the tactical display, indicating potential access points and movement routes within the school building. "Coordinate entry through multiple access points to force the shooter into a defensive position. Use the patrol officer's positioning to channel his movement toward areas where he can be isolated and neutralized." It was the kind of tactical coordination that Sarah had specialized in during her SWAT career, the ability to see complex situations as interconnected systems that could be managed through strategic positioning and coordinated action. Morrison was clearly considering her recommendation, weighing her expertise against the political complications of her recent unauthorized actions. "SWAT arrival in 12 minutes, communications updated. Patrol units report hearing additional shots from the main building." More shots meant continued threat to students and staff who might still be in the building. Morrison made his decision with the same kind of decisive authority that Sarah had demonstrated at Maple Street, choosing operational effectiveness over administrative caution. "Chen, coordinate with SWAT commander on tactical approach. Use your assessment to optimize unit positioning before SWAT arrival." Sarah moved to the communications console and began coordinating with the patrol units on scene, providing tactical guidance based on her analysis of the school layout and the shooter's probable position. It felt natural and familiar, the kind of high-stakes coordination that had always represented the best aspects of law enforcement work. "Unit 7, adjust your position to cover the east entrance. Unit 12, move to the north corridor but maintain distance until backup arrives." The patrol officers responded immediately to her guidance, recognizing tactical expertise when they heard it regardless of recent departmental complications. Sarah could track their movements on the tactical display, watching as they repositioned themselves according to her recommendations. "SWAT arrival in 8 minutes, communications reported. Patrol units report no recent shots from the building." The silence could mean several things. The shooter might have run out of ammunition, might be relocating within the building, or might have barricaded himself in a defensive position. Each possibility required different tactical responses, and the approaching SWAT team would need accurate intelligence to develop an effective entry plan. Sarah was coordinating with the patrol units to gather that intelligence when the radio crackled with urgent traffic. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" Officer down in the main hallway. Another officer wounded, another tactical situation requiring immediate response rather than careful planning. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with life-or-death decisions, the understanding that her recommendations could determine whether people lived or died in the next few minutes. "Chen," Morrison said quietly, "what's your assessment?" Sarah studied the tactical display and processed the radio reports, building a comprehensive picture of the developing situation. The shooter is mobile but contained to the main building. He's engaging targets of opportunity rather than following a planned attack pattern. Patrol units can contain him, but someone needs to coordinate their movements to prevent him from reaching areas with remaining civilians. Morrison nodded, understanding that Sarah's tactical expertise was exactly what the situation required. "Continue coordination with scene commander. I'll handle media and administrative coordination." For the next 6 minutes, Sarah coordinated tactical movements with the patrol units on scene, positioning them to contain the shooter while gathering intelligence for the arriving SWAT team. It was complex work that required real-time analysis of multiple variables, the kind of challenge that had always made tactical operations meaningful for her. SWAT on scene, the radio finally reported, taking operational command from patrol units. Sarah transferred coordination responsibility to the SWAT commander, but continued monitoring the tactical situation as it evolved. The specialized unit moved through the building with practiced efficiency, using the intelligence she had helped gather to locate and neutralize the shooter within minutes of their arrival. Suspect in custody, came the final report. Building secured, no additional casualties. The crisis was over, resolved through the kind of coordinated response that had prevented additional tragedy. Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction that came with successful tactical operations, the knowledge that her skills and judgment had contributed to saving lives. Morrison approached her with an expression that combined relief at the successful resolution with something that might have been recognition of her continued value to the department. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.